It's been 2 weeks since we first heard about Squad's game-changing update, and since then the devs have been in overdrive and have now changed how Ironsights work in their latest patch to the Infantry Combat Overhaul. When transitioning from moving to shooting, you will now aim over your sights and begin point firing, only aiming with your irons once you've stabilized, a mechanic that will supposedly help balance against the slower ADS speeds of Optic users. This is just one of the many changes to Squad that were implemented in last weekend's playtest, and since my first taste of the Infantry Combat Overhaul a couple weeks ago, and now having spent 2 full weekends testing things, there's a lot I'm liking, but still some really big question marks, so let's break down everything you need to know about the upcoming update and how it's feeling so far. If you missed it, June 17th to June 19th was the very first official playtest of the Infantry Combat Overhaul. This was the same build I had early access to, which introduced suppression, picture-in-picture scopes, point firing, and everything else I showcased in my earlier video, which I've linked in the top right here if you still haven't seen it. Now, OWI reached to a number of server communities, including myself as the owner of the potato fields, in order to host the playtest and give everyone a chance to test it for themselves. This is where, well, let's just say all hell broke loose. When the test went live at 1 p.m., the playtest servers went from empty to full almost instantly. Chinese servers were predominantly actually English-speaking players because the servers went live during peak US hours. And the potato fields received so many connections that we were essentially being DDoSed by players just trying to get in and play. Nobody could connect to the server because over the course of 4 minutes, we had over 8,000 connections and nearly 16,000 connection attempts. Literally thousands of people were trying to test all of the new stuff and the capacity was just not there. We actually had to turn down our server queue to only allow 2 people in at a time so the server would slowly fill up and wouldn't continue to refuse connections. And eventually over the course of the afternoon, all of the playtest servers would populate and the devs would even allow us to provide more servers for the test. At one point, there were over 1,500 players logged on playtesting the Infantry Combat Overhaul. And as shown in this graphic by the Reddit user Scuva, it is fair to say that this is the most anticipated content drop in Squad's lifetime, with nearly triple the numbers of players than those who tested Squad 1.0 way back in 2020. At the end of this first weekend, after everyone had played the new updates, most of the feedback I saw on the changes were positive, with many people in the community saying that they loved the new picture-in-picture optics, suppression felt like a tool you could actually use in-game now, and character movement was much less run and gun. Firefights were fun, suppression was a valid tactic, and it was much harder to be a successful lone wolf soldier. As a whole, I would say that the playtest really lived up to the original blog post, and I recall a moment in the game where I just set up my 240 Bravo to watch over a field. I began firing at infantry I noticed in the tree line, and soon a friendly saw gunner just bipoded next to me, and within seconds we were laying down suppressing fire while his entire squad flanked left to engage the enemy. These were the type of moments that just couldn't happen in Squad before the changes, since as a machine gunner you would simply just be headshot before your first burst of gunfire was over, or players would literally just shift W across the field and try to peek kill the enemy instead of flanking. Additionally, I think both new players and experienced players alike appreciated that it felt as if you were being killed less randomly, and I would frequently find myself being able to bandage and take cover before returning fire. Whereas in the live games, I would have most likely been double tapped or one-shot headshot almost instantly. Many people were happy that they were experiencing combat in Squad, and this user put it perfectly. You just weren't dying right away anymore. Aside from the vocal minority, the playtest was wildly successful, and the negatives I think were also generally agreed upon. Weapon handling was a bit too difficult, most notably weapon sway when you first are trying to shoulder your rifle, and trying to accurately hit shots felt a little too much at times, like your character just didn't know how to use a firearm. There were also some issues when trying to handle things like hip-firing machine guns that caused the recoil to look borderline comical, but all of this was actually really minor. Well, the devs took everyone's feedback from this first test, and last week published a list of changes to the Infantry Combat Overhaul, with these being implemented for the second playtest that just ended yesterday. Here were the main changes. First off, the big problem areas like the weapon sway on anti-tank weapons, like AT-4s for example, were reduced in order to make it easier to pop open the sights and engage an enemy vehicle. Second, longer range optics like the 1P78 and the M150 ACOGs had their blur animation reduced when going into ADS. Peripheral blur around the scope was also reduced, and even the blur when firing was reduced, making these much easier to find targets and engage in semi-auto. Suppression was also tweaked, making it less likely for your screen to go insta-blurry, which was reported as being really disorienting for users, but the distance at which explosions caused suppression was increased, and you were more likely to be suppressed with explosions through walls while in buildings. Heavy machine guns had their bullet spread reduced, making them deadlier, since many people felt as if during the first playtest the random bullet deviation was just way too inaccurate. And additionally, point fire recoil was also reduced for rifles and marksman rifles, making them much more viable when on the move and non-ADS'd. These changes were all direct results of feedback from the community, but the devs also included a few new added features that took us all by surprise. First was the inclusion of variable optics, which will completely change weapons like DMRs and snipers. If a weapon has an optic that has different zoom levels, you can now press F and you'll begin to cycle through them. At the moment, this feature is only included on the M110, the SVDM, and the SV98, and it makes for a much better experience when trying to engage in longer range shots, as you can see here. Also, users were reporting that quick transitions to the higher powered zoom and the new picture-in-picture scopes were extremely disorienting. So now, instead of just right-clicking and you being 8 times zoomed automatically, you can actually now have these optics set to a lower magnification while you're running around, making closer range fights much easier if you have to quickly try an ADS. Additionally, as shown in the intro, the VDV were added to the playtest, and with them came the new AK-12. On the Ironsight variant, it appears as if the devs are testing a new Ironsight mechanic, and now instead of being able to instantly right-click ADS and shoot through front and rear sights, your character will first aim over the top of their rifle until you become stabilized. Once stable, your sights go back up to the typical Ironsight ADS view. This was only implemented on the AK-12, while the other rifles still have a very rocky sight picture before evening out. And personally, I do like the idea of this, but in testing, it definitely needs some tweaking. You actually can't move forward more than a few steps without swapping to this point fire, and the transition from point firing to ADS feels really slow and unnatural. I would still like to see this mechanic included, but maybe instead of this automatic stable-unstable thing, you actually have this as a variable sight option for Ironsight users. Just like the DMRs can adjust their sights, it would be great if Ironsight players could simply choose between this lower sight option and higher sight option, swapping between the two as they move and engage targets. If I was moving around trying to clear a building or something, I would definitely like to use this option instead of having the giant sights in my face and taking up the entirety of my screen. So it would be really cool if I could select this and actually move forward with this. So these two new additions plus all the tweaks was everything that was changed going into playtest number 2. And they look good on paper, but how did that actually feel and turn out when you were playing a real game of Squad? Well, over the past weekend, I played quite a few rounds of playtest number 2. I was testing red dots, ACOGs, anti-tank weapons, the machine guns, Ironsights, and I've got to say, I surprisingly didn't really like it. Suppression as a whole felt a lot less impactful, and it seemed that with the reduced screen blur, players were more frequently able to fire back and engage, when during the first playtest they had to try and either reposition or ask for support. Add in the fact that players as a whole had reduced weapon sway, it made it much easier to essentially camp a location, wait for contact, and then kill the enemy that was shooting you by yourself, and then you could move out. Ironically, it felt as if there was more bushwookies this time around than the first test, and it just made for a really frustrating experience at times. Squads that could easily hold a location in the first playtest were also punished more frequently in the second playtest due to the fact that players had an easier time running and gunning. In a video published by KarmaCut right before the second playtest started, his biggest complaint was that the weapon sway was too intense, making it almost impossible to shoot. Yet in almost every single example he used, you can see he is pretty much sprinting around, trying to ADS, and then gets killed because he's, well, out of stamina. And the whole purpose of these changes were to prevent the gameplay that he's actually showcasing in this video. The second playtest seemed to give a much bigger crutch to running and gunning players, while also punishing those who tried to implement some sort of suppression tactic. It was a weird combination that just made for a pretty bad experience as a whole, but I will say that I think they nailed it with the anti-tank weapons and variable zoom optics. Moving forward, I think the next playtest should be much closer to the first implementation of suppression and weapon sway. There needs to be a downside to using ACOGs at close range, and this most recent playtest actually caused me to give up using red dots entirely since it was just easier using a magnified optic. And that is not at all what the devs were trying to do with the Infantry Combat Overhaul. To summarize, the second playtest discouraged suppression usage due to the fact that players were now much more accurate, encouraged them to peek and take out machine guns, or simply camp in a bush waiting for someone to take the first shot. And there was a lot more running and gunning since you were punished a lot less for sprinting around and ADSing. As a whole, it felt a lot more like current squad than the original idea of the Infantry Combat Overhaul, and honestly, I was pretty disappointed. My recommendation would be to revert back to playtest number 1, Suppression and Sway, to do a little bit of minor adjustments to the ADS transitions when players have 50% or more stamina, but keep the punishing sway for those who have no stamina or large optics. By having these small adjustments from playtest number 1 instead of going all the way to the playtest number 2 overcorrection, we should make it a little bit easier to kill the enemy without completely negating the added factor of suppression tactics. Now, in saying all that, this is the whole point of testing. The devs seem to have overcorrected on quite a few things on this second playtest, but they are obviously listening to feedback, and it seems as if they're in no rush to quickly push out this update to the live game and instead want to make sure it's done right. For that, I've got to give them credit. If you're seeing all this and you like it or you don't like it and you want to make sure your voice is heard either way, I would really join the official squad Discord and keep an eye out for their announcement channels since they ping everyone when the playtest occurs, and they also ping people to fill out the official feedback forms. As of now, it looks like these tests will be every weekend, Saturdays through Mondays for at least the next few weeks, so you should have plenty of chances to try it out for yourself. I do think there is a very vocal minority out there that dislike the changes so far, but from reading all of y'all's comments on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and talking to y'all in game, it seems as if the vast majority of y'all are really buying into this overhaul, so I hope the devs see that and do act accordingly. But what do you guys think? Is playtest 2 a step in the right direction, or are we just going back to squad's old ways? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. But that's it for me. Until next time, peace.